Hello all, and welcome to a new project on the channel. We're going to be going and trying to into ancient Greece and looking really at the birth of not just philosophy but logos in general. Now, we had been talking about Campbell for many months on the channel and all of the myths that he described in his analysis of primitive cultures and how the importance of story for civilization, for really communication between a people. And with Greece, and if you look back at Gebser and what he says about the different conscious structures, then I think with the Hellenic tradition here and looking at how it was not just thought of, but what would it be like to perhaps stand in the place of what the pre-Socratics that we're going to be going over the next few weeks on the channel, and how they really took the myths of Homer and how they made the rational structure to come out of that. And to really do this, I think the best way is to get the most value out of this discussion is to go all the way back to the Homeric poems. And really, what Homer does is to exemplify in Greek culture what it means to be the Greek hero. And in the Iliad, of course, we have the story of Achilles. And Achilles is, of course, really a pirate, if you will, a sort of brutish expression. And it's a sort of expression of the will of just the masculine, of having the sort of greater will exerted on his enemies. And this is really the Homeric virtue, if you will. But if we want to go even earlier than that, we could look at how Prometheus kind of sets the stage really in his myth. And of course, if you want to throw in how Nietzsche, who was greatly influenced by the Greeks, and how he affirms them against really the Victorian era Christianity that he was disposed of against. And with Prometheus, you have the demonstration of how Prometheus steals the fire of the gods, and it brings the gods down, as Nietzsche discusses and affirms, in how they're not just these omnipotent, all-knowing, they exemplify the greatest virtues, if you will, of what man cannot even actually achieve. They're clearly demonstrated above what man is. But with Prometheus, he brings the gods down. And of course, he is tortured by Zeus and has his liver eaten on a daily basis. But this doesn't stop Prometheus from knowing the fact that the prophecy is that the gods will be eventually overthrown. And this really brings them down to the earthly condition, if you will. It brings them down to the hubris, if you will, of being subjected to the same vices, if you will, of man. Now, in the Iliad and the Odyssey, if you wanted to educate in ancient Greece, of course, as I've mentioned many times on the channel, a Greek education at the time really was necessary to have a great and firm understanding of the Homeric tradition here, and how this will play out into the ideals of what Greek culture, what is expected really of man and his pursuit of excellence. Now, of course, with these poems, it's important to point out that these stories, these oral traditions, really, or at least we can suppose that these were orally told for many centuries before they're actually written down. And so we could say that many of these stories likely occurred over many centuries, and it wasn't just a one act all in history. So, for example, I discussed this with a friend the other day. There was likely many of these Trojan Wars, if you will, but within the structure of myth, this gets really compressed down, as Marshall McLuhan would talk about, and made into a one dimension for the purpose of telling stories of ritual, of many times in the act of singing, if you will. We can perhaps extend this to Achilles' attitude throughout the Iliad, because he's very direct. There's really no interpretation necessary beyond what his actions are. He's very direct with his strength. And in the first book of the Iliad, you have Agamemnon, who kind of acts as the foe of being extremely self-gratuitous, of not really accepting responsibility for his actions, but he wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants, of course, the status, the glory, if you will, of what it means to be a leader, but he doesn't want to take the repercussions of that. And in his character, I think that really is the central point of who he is and what he's all about. Now, Agamemnon, he takes the slave girl, and this slave girl, of course, happens to be the daughter of the priest of Apollo. So the priest asks for the help of Achilles to get the slave girl back. And when Agamemnon is confronted by Achilles on the slave girl being this priest's daughter of Apollo, Apollo, in retaliation, is accused, or at least it is believed that he is causing these epidemics, causing illness around him by using his arrows to strike the civilization and attack it for retribution. Now, I think this is very interesting because I think this kind of lends itself to understanding the window of, as we're going to demonstrate in this video, going from myth to logos. So there's a mythic expression here for why this epidemic is taking place. It's Apollo shooting his arrows onto the people and causing illness. And in the mythos structure, phenomena is really an understanding of natural disaster, or phenomena that is happening to us that isn't explained in a sort of rationalist or a scientific understanding. It is more of stories that bridge together the explanation needed really for humanity. And so in this structure, objects there's no difference between an object and a subject. Further this example, there is an account of how memoriams, something like a Greek statue, if you will, could be put on trial for something like murder. There's a story of a statue falling onto a man, and the statue is actually put to trial. So again, this kind of shows how there's no distinction between us as human subjects and objects that are around us. Objects can cause phenomena and has a sort of understanding, or lack thereof, if you will, that they have a sort of direct correlation to the events happening around them. And eventually this statue is actually tossed at sea. And so this just kind of shows that we don't have any sort of difference between a subject and an object. In an interesting way, I think that this kind of applies to the character Achilles himself, where, he acts very much like an object. He doesn't have very much subjectivity to him until the very end. Agamemnon is, of course, angered by this confrontation with Achilles and his backing of Apollo. But, of course, he cannot out-muscle Achilles. Achilles is a war machine. And Achilles chooses to, of course, avenge what has happened to this slave girl, even though he doesn't really care necessarily about the slave girl itself. He just wants to exert his will, I would say, in a sort of act of how he feels disrespected. It has nothing to do really with the slave girl itself. And in the last moment, of course, before he is about to kill Agamemnon, Athena comes down and stops him and says that give it time, the retribution will come. You do not need to do this. And so Achilles, despite feeling, of course, disrespected, displays, well, we can't really call it self-control because it didn't come within himself. He had to have Athena come down herself to actually stop him. And so he refuses to fight anymore. And in doing so, he actually decides to desert the expedition against the Trojans. And he chooses to sail home with his people. And in retaliation to this, there will be really no success for conquering of Troy without him. And in the meantime, as Achilles deserts the Greeks here, Hector is introduced, and he is kind of the adversary or Troy's answer to Achilles, really, or his sort of greatest rival in this case, where he starts routing the Greeks several times because they can't invoke the greatness of their warrior Achilles. And so this leads to Nestor being introduced, who is the character of wisdom. And he tells Agamemnon that you're not going to be able to conquer Troy without Achilles. Whether Agamemnon, in all of his pride, if he can see this or not, he ultimately understands whether or not he understands that his own actions are really the responsibility here to driving Achilles away. This doesn't change the states of affairs fact that the Greeks are losing because they do not have Achilles. And so Nestor suggests to send a sort of ambassador to Achilles to try to convince him to come back. Include in this ambassador group Odysseus, who really represents, I think, the Greek wonder child, as John David Ebert would talk about. He's very bright, quick-witted, much younger than the wisdom that Nestor has. And then we also have Phoenix, who is the tutor of Achilles. And then they choose Ajax, because Ajax represents the old guard. He's respected, and he's expected to lure them with the treasures of the glory that conquering Troy, and of course the return of the slave girl herself. And so they bring him all of these different gifts. They're really trying to wine and dine Achilles to come back. And it's worth noting that Achilles himself, when they do get there, is very agreeable. And Achilles, despite being described as very brutish, he's the ultimate warrior, he is quite eloquent, which is expected, of course, in Greek society. Even though they have this reputation of being pirates, they're very hospitable people. And I think that this is important to understand for how, when we get to Plato's dialogues, why overall, unless of course you're Socrates shutting down a sophist, and even then, on that intellectual capacity, they kind of just quiet down and wither away. They don't just act out of pocket, if you will. And that's very common with Greek culture, I think, that you would see in the ancient Greeks here. Achilles, despite how eloquent he is, of course, he has a sincerity about him that there is no real depth to him. his action is one-to-one, and whatever he desires, he simply acts upon. And I think, and certainly as as I'm starting to get older now, of course, but when I first read this in high school, there's something totally badass about how Achilles just he says what he means, he does what he wants. Achilles is the ideal, I think, of young men who they're fearless, they aren't afraid to sugarcoat. Achilles can't even really understand what lying is, as we'll get into. And this is, again, the Homeric ideal of Greek culture, with the prideful warrior class personified in these heroic acts. And so Achilles, for example, when he's given an opportunity at mercy, he doesn't have any interest in these material possessions, the attainment of wealth, because he's offered a sort of ransom if he lets this adversary go that he bests. Achilles decides to impale him with a spear because Achilles ultimately knows his destiny. He knows he is to die, and wealth isn't what he wants. He wants kudos for the Greeks, which is, of course, glory. Glory is the highest regard of human achievement because, of course, Achilles is going to die in some battle one day, or in this case, in trying to conquer Troy. Achilles knows he will die at Troy, but he's going to live on and be remembered forever for this quest for glory. There's a bit of irony there in dying for your ambitions to ultimately have a sort of a testament to immortality. And moving forward, Achilles says at the embassy, he says that there is no place for liars, and he hates and there's a long line of liars at the gates of Hades who says one thing and does another. And so he has this total disdain for liars. But I think that part of the reason why that is because Achilles, he can't complexify his subjectivity to actually be able to think a certain way and act in a different way. He just doesn't have any possibility of being able to tell a lie. He can't comprehend the verbal difference from the actual matters at hand in one's thinking. Where Odysseus, as we're going to get into with the Odyssey, he lies frequently in his stories, which is an interesting distinction here. Achilles, again, he's somewhat of an object. There is no subjectivity and object distinction. He's the greatest of warriors, but he has little in regards of the mind. And after killing Hector, Achilles does show a bit of a change in his character over the course of the Iliad, because he experiences a hypothetical. He breaks down crying for Hector's father asks for his son's body, but it's totally been destroyed and desecrated by Achilles. And this really shows Achilles for the first time acknowledging that other people have feelings, and he knows that he is supposed to die, and he's seeing Hector's father crying, and ultimately this means that hypothetically when he dies, he is going to cause great sadness to his own father, and he'll make his own father cry. And Achilles, in this hypothetical, he displays powerful emotions for the first time. And I think this is how, again, if we're going to step in the foots of the ancient Greeks, how within the Iliad we see Achilles make this shift here at the very end, where he actually experiences a form of subjectivity, really, of actually being able to think of a hypothetical that isn't just in pure emotive action. And this, I think, leads to the later poem with the Odyssey, which is introduces the second poem that Homer wrote. And we see a bunch of changes here. And not just the poem, but the characters, as well as Greek culture as a whole. Because we've seen now the shift from the nomadic warrior cult, and of course they never really truly, lose this until much later on. But, they've learned about really the mercantile lifestyle of the necessity of being sedentary, and to not act in such a nomadic way. And so you see a shift away from the attitude of Achilles to one of trade, to one of intellect, to having the more empire-like mindset that we're more than capable of course, invoking that warrior will of defending themselves, but it's in a much more practical way than before. And so Odysseus has gained a dimension over the Iliad because he now shows the ability to outwit people, even though it is in the faculty of conquering and still being a warrior. This is a much different way of going about it than just exerting the strength and will that Achilles does. And we see actually in one of the most famous parts of these poems here in a flashback, he actually of course creates the strategy of the Trojan horse after thinking that the Greeks had already deserted the expedition, and this of course leads to the end of Troy. And so this shows how the story goes from the nomadic to the sedentary, of more long scale civilizational means and trade, and offers a more complex system than just these sort of nomads that we saw prior, of just traveling around, pillaging and raiding. And so as the story goes, when Odysseus, he goes home to Ithaca, and by doing this return home, he creates this well thought out disguise to actually even be able to return to his homeland. Odysseus is calculated and will not waver to the pure emotional response. There's no need for Athena to come down to console Odysseus, unlike with Achilles. And, again, the Homerics here, they're trying to show what, if you will, the Platonic form of what being a great man is. And we see somewhat of a more stoic attitude now, of not letting your emotions overcome you into just blind rage and induced action, if you will. And so Odysseus, in his return home, he has a reflection of his life and recounts the encounter with Poseidon's son, the Cyclops, who was blinded by Odysseus. And of course, in the act of hubris, of pride, he declares as he's doing it that you were blinded by Odysseus. And of course, Poseidon's going to find out who blinded his son. But before Poseidon can enact revenge, Zeus intervenes with this plan that Poseidon's going to do to kill Odysseus. And he grants that, you can torture him, you can, cause him a lot of problems, if you will, but you can't kill him because I have a plan for him, and he must return home. And so the Odyssey is really the story of overcoming pride and how man's darkness, his misdeeds that he's reflecting on in his life, they have to be righted. The stories go as a sort of series of misfortune for Odysseus, who has to lose everything from the fate of Zeus. And in order to do this, of course, unlike with Achilles, there has to be complexity to Odysseus. He has to have layers to who he is as a being. There has to be a level of subjectivity that we've gone over several times in this video now, to his character, in order for him to lose everything. He has to be stripped down and put into a sort of bare naked existence. Whereas with Achilles, there's none of that. The layer is he's alive and he's a warrior, and you have to kill him, and there's it's just that. And Odysseus, he after killing and doing a violent act, he notices that one of his servants is really gleeful over this, and this really sends something off in Odysseus that it's really unholy, unbecoming, if you will, to vaunt over the bodies of the dead. And this refers back to how Hector was so desecrated in his demise, to the point where there was nothing left to give to his father. And this, of course, evoked that emotional response with Achilles. And so that's really the lesson to get out of the Odyssey. Now, of course, I wanted to wrap this all together to how we end up with the Logos and really the start of philosophy here. Because as we fast forward now to Socrates, Socrates is the late great Greek hero of the philosopher king. And he's introduced as not this great brutish warrior, or in the case with Odysseus, he's not just this cunning, intellectual, but still very warrior orientated being who, still does violent acts, even though he tries to, correct that in the end. Socrates is introduced, and in his acts, he isn't looking for destruction. He's not trying to embark on the hubris journey, if you will, of the warrior class that Homer talked about. He is of virtue. He is of knowledge and wisdom. He wants to improve the republic, not just tear down all of the competing civilizations or problems around him. He is the warrior of the soul. He is the one who wants to improve the republic and not destroy others. And so we're beginning to see the shift, and it started very gradually as Homer wrote down all of these great warrior tales against the Trojans that, again, I believe happened over many centuries. There were many Trojan Wars, I believe. And we see now the emphasis on intellectual capabilities of the rational conscious structure that Jean Gebser talked about in the late Hellenics. And this, of course, coincides with how the pre-Socratics are going to be introduced in their understanding of elements. And this ties into how we have the mythic structure of explanation, with how Apollo was causing epidemics because he is the god of health and sickness. And now we begin to see the start of not just science, but the natural sciences, of politics, of ethics, of history, even, as we'll get into. And this is really the birth of how I believe Logos really gets started, that we see traced all the way through the Homeric epics. And so you have the scientific revolution for the Greeks, which gets going at about 600 BC in Iona. And whenever you have a change in science, you change everything. All of culture really changes, because in order to, make of, quite literally, what science has to say of what we have learned, this is going to change all of culture, and to the point where the ideas of what virtue is going to shift to an intellectual one, more than just the pirate tales that we've just discussed here in this video. And if you guys want to continue to embark on that journey with me, I invite you all to subscribe, comment, and like the video. And I hope you guys enjoy this video and the rest of them to come.